Puddle Lane, the tale of a tale. The tale of a tale. Sarah lived in Puddle Lane. She had a strange friend called the Griffle. The Griffle was a green monster. He could vanish whenever he wanted to. The Griffle had long green ears. He had big green eyes and a long green tail. This is a story about the Griffle's tail and what happened when somebody pulled it. Sarah. Mrs. Pitter-Patter lived in Puddle Lane. Mrs. Pitter-Patter always made a great deal of noise, and she was always asking questions. Mrs. Pitter-Patter. One day, when she was outside in the lane, Mrs. Pitter-Patter saw Sarah. Sarah was playing hide and seek with the Griffle. The Griffle could vanish when he wanted to, so he was very good at hiding. Mrs. Pitter-Patter saw Sarah. "What are you doing, Sarah?" asked Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I'm playing with my friend," said Sarah. "What friend?" asked Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I'm playing with my friend the Griffle," said Sarah. "What Griffle?" asked Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I can't see anyone." Sarah and Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "Look," said Sarah. "If you look very hard, you can see the Griffle's ears." "What ears?" said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I can only see 2 green leaves." "Look," said Sarah. "Look," said Sarah. "If you look very hard, you can see the Griffle's eyes." "What eyes?" asked Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I can only see 2 green flowers." "Look," said Sarah. "Look," said Sarah. "If you look a little harder, you can see the Griffle's tail." "What tail?" asked Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I can't see any tail." "Look," said Sarah. The Griffle's green tail was hanging over the wall. Mrs. Pitter-Patter saw it. "That's a green rope," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "But it isn't a rope," said Sarah. "It's the Griffle's tail." "Of course it's a rope," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "I shall pull it down." She took hold of the Griffle's tail and gave a long, hard pull. Mrs. Pitter-Patter pulled the Griffle's green tail. The Griffle jumped down from the wall with a roar. The whole of the Griffle was there. You could see every bit of him. The Griffle jumped down from the wall. Mrs. Pitter-Patter dropped the tail with a yell. She made such a noise that she woke Mr. Go-to-Bed, who was fast asleep in bed in the house at the end of the lane. Mr. Go-to-Bed woke up. Mr. Go-to-Bed jumped out of bed and ran to the window. He threw up the window and looked out into the lane. The Griffle had vanished again, but he saw Mrs. Pitter-Patter. Mr. Go-to-Bed looked out of the window. Mrs. Pitter-Patter ran away. "What was that?" cried Mr. Go-to-Bed. "What happened? What's happened? Where are you running to, Mrs. Pitter-Patter?" Mrs. Pitter-Patter was running so fast down the lane that she didn't hear what Mr. Go-to-Bed said. She didn't even see him. Mrs. Pitter-Patter ran away. Mrs. Pitter-Patter reached her own door. She ran into the house and shut the door behind her with a bang. Mrs. Pitter-Patter ran into the house. Mr. Gotobed shook his head. What a noise Mrs. Pitter-Patter makes, he said, and at this time of day too, just when I'd got to sleep. Mr. Gotobed shut his window and went back to bed. Mr. Gotobed went back to bed. Where are you, Griffle? Asked Sarah. Sarah saw 2 green ears poking up over the wall. Has she gone? Asked the Griffle. He spoke very softly, in a whiffly-griffly voice. Sarah saw 2 green ears. Yes, she's gone, said Sarah. Please come back and play. 2 green eyes appeared under the green ears. The Griffle looked down the lane. The Griffle looked down the lane. I think I'll come another day when she isn't about, he said. The ears and the eyes disappeared, and Sarah went home. Sarah went home. Mrs. Pitter-Patter. The Griffle. The Griffle's tail. Mr. Gotobed. Window. Bed.